Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. This will be a detailed tutorial on how I make this on my sewing machine. So if you want to see that, stay tuned. So I'm starting off with my frontal, and I'm just folding it in half so I can find the middle of it, and I'm sticking a T-pin in it. There's usually a line down the middle of your canvas head, and you're just gonna line that up. And then I'm going to place T-pins all along the edge of that frontal just to put it in place so where I want it to be while I'm sewing it. As you can see, I'm starting off with it braided so that the hair is out of the way and it's less hassle for me while I'm sewing the frontal down. So to make my first knot when I'm starting off, I place the needle in between the two strands of the thread. So as I go along, I'm making sure that my stitches are very close together. This just allows for there to not be any bulking. And then just like how I put the needle through the two strands of thread on the first stitch, as I go along, I'm making sure that my needle goes in between the thread. As you can see here, it makes like a little loop, and I'm making sure that my needle is in between that thread as it gets tightened onto the frontal. This just allows for security, and I just do this all the way down to the end, and you'll see how I close the frontal off. So here I don't go through the frontal first, I go through the cap. This is for me to secure the knots on my frontal so that when I cut the thread, it doesn't go anywhere. So I'm going to explain it. I go through the cap and I loop the thread around the needle about 4 times. That usually makes a sufficient enough knot for me. And then this again just secures the thread so that it doesn't unravel once I cut it. Okay, so I do not go from one end of the frontal to the next, and I don't start in the middle. I try to go somewhere between where a middle part will be and a deep side part will be so that the knots that I'm starting off with to create my stitches is not seen. So you saw me do one half of the frontal. Now I'm just going in and doing the other half of the frontal. The same process, making sure the stitches are really close together, and I close it off the same way. I leave at least 2 knots at the end. So if the first one isn't as secure, there's another extra layer of security. So once I'm done sewing the frontal onto the cap, the next thing that I do is create guidelines on the wig cap for when I'm sewing the tracks. So I take a marker and I make lines about 1 inch apart. I'm just eyeballing this, and then I use this as a guideline. Sometimes I don't usually stay exactly on the line, it just depends, but so that I make sure I'm sewing the tracks on the cap straight, I do this. This is very helpful. And then I do the middle first, and then I go in on the sides and line them up until I get all the way up to the frontal. And then you'll see later on that I leave the last 3 or 4 guidelines at the top, and I don't bring it all the way to the frontal, just so that they're straight. And then once you're parting, the tracks are not lumpy or that you cannot see them. It just goes seamlessly along with the cap, the frontal, and your head. So here's what I'm talking about, that I don't go all the way to the frontal. I just connect them to the lines that's going to the frontal. So here's another step that I take before I start sewing the tracks onto the wig cap. I go in and double weft all my tracks. Usually this is for especially longer lengths. I sometimes don't do this for shorter lengths such as bobs. To make sure you get the thickness, you need to double weft those tracks. This is why I like making wigs myself and custom making them, because I can get them as thick as I want to. Those vendor made standard wigs are just too thin for me. So now we're getting into sewing the tracks onto the dome cap to complete the wig. You'll see me backstitching right here. So a tip, whenever you're starting on a row and completing a row of tracks, you want to backstitch a couple times just to secure that stitch and make sure that they don't unravel. A couple other tips, but you do not want to stretch your cap. You don't want to be pulling on the cap and everything. You want it to go naturally. Your tracks and everything will move as you sew them because that's how sewing machines are. It moves things along. So you don't want to do any extra pulling or tugging because if you do that, you will create lumps in your wig, and we don't want that. Sometimes you will see me kind of pushing it through if my needle starts to get stuck, but just a little bit. Or even right here, you saw me pull just a little bit on the other end, but you don't see me doing a lot. You see my hands kind of staying in the same positions and just letting the machine work itself. Another thing I want to mention is that this is an elastic cap. So as you're going along, you'll see bulking, as you can see right here. Like there's a lot of like bulking and folding, but as you go along through that on that track, the sewing machine will kind of smooth it out as it's going along. See, I'm not doing a lot of pulling and tugging and trying to smooth the cap out. I'm just letting it go, and then those creases and folds are just naturally coming out as it's moving along. Another thing I want you to take note of right here, you can see my lace is kind of folded and is very close to where I'm sewing right now. So you want to make sure any previous tracks or your lace, your braids on your frontal, anything is not under where you are sewing, because you will have to undo those stitches and then sew again. You want to eliminate that hassle, making sure that there's nothing underneath where you're sewing. So as you're sewing and moving up the cap, when you get to the area where the tracks start at the frontal, put the dome cap under the latch first, and then I slide the tracks under the latch so that it's easier for me to not have to hassle to get both in at the same time. That'll also apply once I get to the top where the four lines are that doesn't connect to the frontal. So that's basically it. Y'all can watch me sew the rest of the track. I'll show how this wig looks at the end. So this will be a series. On the next part, I'll be showing you how I customize this wig. So bleaching the knots, plucking, and also prepping it for styling. And this unit came out so pretty. You can get this texture of hair, also a custom wig made on my website, Rene'e.com. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for other videos.